This presentation and accompanying handout are copyrighted material. Copyright 2021, Margaret M. McMahon Teaching and Training Company, LLC, all rights reserved. Hello, I'm Margaret McMahon, and I'm here to talk about Write Their Story, From Timeline to Young Reader's Book. This is part 1 of a 2-video series. Have you researched your family tree? Have you learned about great ancestors? Have you uncovered some really interesting stories about them? And have you wanted to share what you found out with your family? If you've answered yes to any or all of these, then writing a simple illustrated young reader's book is probably a great idea for you. In part 1, we'll talk about the introduction, we'll learn about young readers' books and what makes them, the decisions that you'll need to know at the very start of your project. We'll cover timelines and then how to get started on that book. So why a young reader? Well, young readers' books are really in the Goldilocks zone. A picture book would be too simple, just a picture and a few words. That wouldn't convey a story. A book for adults, well, that's going to be pretty detailed, and it's also going to be difficult to write. And a young reader's book just falls in the middle. It's just right. It's also more likely to be read than a research report, say. And when you put things together like more manageable to write and to read, you've got something that's more shareable. Well, let's just take a little closer look at a report versus a young reader's book page. Well, here's a page from a report I wrote. I wrote it as proof argument as part of the ProGen study group in which I'm currently enrolled. And you can see it's a very dense page. It's not really reader friendly. In fact, the only readable part by most people, the narrative, is up at the top. The rest of the bottom is footnotes and notes discussing the facts that are presented. Now, this is all very valuable information, and this is great for genealogists, and it's good documentation, very solid. But your non-genealogy relatives are probably going to be intimidated and really not too motivated to read it. But then you take a look at a page from a young reader's book, and here you have a picture. You might have a sentence or two. It's very brief, and it's certainly very welcoming. Now, one of the things I found out when I was coming up with this concept was that my brother, who was very interested in the research that I was doing about our grandfather's World War I service, would look at reports and documents that I brought home from the National Archives or from another archives, and he would read them and glance at them. But when I gave him the pages of this book, it just lifted it to another level. It really engaged him, and it was something that I saw a terrific value in. Another part of this is that a young reader's book will just tell one story. It has a beginning and an end that are well defined. There might not even be any dialogue, or if there is, it would be simple. And best of all, there's no footnotes. But I do want you to keep track of your sources. Now, young readers' books are going to be bounded by a couple of things. One is the I Can Read books that come in at about 2,500 words or less. They're 32 to 64 pages, and these are two of my son's favorite books from his childhood. They're written by Nathaniel Benchley, and they tell a story of the Revolutionary War from both sides. Now, a chapter book from my early childhood was Peter and the Rocket Ship. Now, these are going to come in less than 12,000 words and less than 100 pages, and they're going to have fewer pictures. Now, somewhere in the middle is Tomahawks and Trombones, the story of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Now, historical fiction books like these are written to inspire young readers. So you're typically going to see them from a young character's point of view, but not always, like tomahawks and trombones. So what do I need to decide up front before I start one of these books? Got some decisions to make. I need to decide about the story that I'm going to tell, which ancestor or ancestors I'm going to be talking about, and which event or events are important or critical at the core of the story. Now the images, what am I going to use? Am I going to use photos, drawings, maybe maps? What if I don't have any? Well, we'll cover that in the second video, don't worry. And now my distribution choices. Am I going to do a self-published book, or am I going to maybe print one out and distribute it at family gatherings? Perhaps I'm going to do it all digitally and just send it out in an email. Well, how do I start? Well, the first thing is pick an ancestor, or maybe a group of ancestors like a family unit. And what you're going to do is probably pick a backdrop of an important historical event or a couple of related events. And what you want to do to make this more interesting and inspiring is to make sure to include the challenges that the family or person faced and how they overcame them. This will be valuable to descendants of these ancestors. So now collect materials, and you've probably already done this in your research. You're going to get the records that you've collected. You're also going to get the other research information that you have, or maybe the conclusions that you've come to. And I want you to go ahead and get context from the time. Now, contemporary newspapers are great for this. They're going to have the facts and the story about how it affected people. And also, I want you to take a look at diaries. Now, your ancestor may not have left you a diary. No ancestors have left me one either. But if you find one about somebody who is in the same place at the same time, doing something similar, you're going to look through their eyes and probably see what your ancestors saw too. So I can't say enough about the use of diaries to add color and to add perspective to these kinds of stories. You also have books, whether they're history books or autobiographical books or just insights into what was going on, and also the family stories that you've collected. Finding the records and finding the data is incredibly important to genealogists, but the context can take the research to a whole nother level. And in fact, the context becomes very important when you're writing a young reader's book. Well, for example, let's take the context from the beginning of factual information that I had for my grandfather's World War I service and showing you where it can go with using other documents and books. Well, here we have the service abstract, and we have that my grandfather was in Company B of the 51st Pioneer Infantry to his discharge. Now, this is the document we pulled the initial dates off of, so we know when he went overseas. We know when he was inducted, and we also know that he had no wounds. Well, from the book Battle Participation of Organizations of the American Expeditionary Forces, we find out about the battle participation of the 51st Pioneers. We find out that they were part of the San Miguel offensive, and we also find out that they were listed as being part of the Tools sector activities. In fact, these are bars that the pioneer infantrymen could wear on their World War I medals. Now, from the official history of the 51st Pioneer Infantry, which used to be at the War College and is now at NARA 2, we can read about the activities of Company B. Well, that's a little hard to read, so even if I blow it up, it's still hard to read. So let's read the transcription. 1 a.m. The company marched from the station with gas masks at the alert and ready for any emergency to their position north of Beaumont in the rear of the front infantry line trenches, arriving at the designated point at 4:45 a.m. It was during this advance that the company came into the shell fire for the first time. Well, this is a lot different from hearing that they participated in a battle. This is what they were doing in the battle. They were marching from 1 a.m. and they got to the front at 4:45. The whole time they had their masks at the ready. And this is when they had their first shell fire experience. Now this is colorful information that fills in the details. In fact, at this point, my son was hooked on learning about family history when he read this. Now let's dig a little deeper. Let's go to a diary written by a sergeant from Company B. This would be somebody who was standing near my grandfather at the front at the beginning of the Battle of San Miguel. And here's his page in handwriting, which again would be a little tough to read, so I just printed it out. We left the woods marching under heavy shell fire. We arrived at the front at 5 a.m. just in time to see the first wave of our troops go over the top. We started right in to repair roads and bridges destroyed by the German shell fire so that the supplies and artillery could follow up the infantry advance. At this place, we began to realize what war really was. Wounded being brought as we were repairing one bridge, 4 men were killed about 20 feet away from us. Well, this is describing the same events. We had one line saying that the 51st Pioneers were part of that battle. Then we had the official company history. But then when we get as far as a diary, we find out more about not just the story, but what they saw. And yes, the official history is 4:45. The sergeant remembers it at 5 a.m. And it also gives this incredible feeling of what they were seeing. In fact, the Pioneer infantry did have rifles, but they were repairing roads as shells were going off around them. All right, let's build a timeline. So now timelines are going to represent all the events in an ancestor's life. You're going to list them all in chronological order, and each point on the timeline is going to have a date, the type of event it was, and also the location where it occurred. You're going to create one for a person or maybe a whole family, depending on your story. Now, we often see these timelines incredibly useful in census research, so I hope that you're doing this kind of thing, because if you have a timeline and you're looking for an ancestor, you know where they were at a specific time, and you can limit or focus your searches there. Now, if you also have ancestors with common names, well, you can look and say, hey, I know that person isn't my ancestor because they lived on the other side of the country at that point. So I hope you're using these in your research anyhow. Another bonus with timelines, they uncover holes in your research. So the very exotic tools that you'll be using are word processing programs, spreadsheet programs, maybe even a graphic program, something you have on your computer, or good old pencil and paper. And this is usually how I like to start because I like to be very engaged with what I'm doing. The idea of drawing it out and sticking items on helps me to focus. But I usually end up transferring them to an electronic document because they're easier to share that way and easier to store and use. Now, your family tree programs, if you've been going ahead and entering all the data into a family tree program, you should be able to generate timelines from there. I find them a little less useful than the very simple ones that I construct. So let's go ahead and build a timeline. The first thing you're going to do is put the person or family group's name on the top, and then you're going to start with their birth at the beginning of the line. Because you might do this vertically. You might be a person who likes to do it from left to right. It really doesn't matter so long as it's easy for you to use. So you put the birth at one end, the death and burial at the other, if you know it, and then you start filling in the life events. You're going to add their residences, where they moved, their military service, where they worked, and the schools they attended. And now the extra credit, of course, is to put in the historical events. Now they not only give you context, they also may give you factors that influenced why your ancestors did what they did when they did it. Here's an example timeline for Robert Frost. He was one of my father's favorite poets. And this timeline was actually created just pulling facts from a Wikipedia article at the time. I like to use this in my classes to demonstrate how to do timelines. Well, we start with his birth and we end with his death and burial. And we have just all the different events of his life. Now remember I said that there is a bonus using timelines because it's really easy to see where you have some holes and missing pieces. In this case, we don't know what he did after he left Harvard and before he went to work at Pinkerton Academy. We also don't know what he did in Glasgow and in fact when he came back. And then there's a huge part after he left Amherst College and his death. We also don't have places for his birth and his marriage. Now it turns out that this great New England poet was really born in San Francisco. Now the timelines can focus on one ancestor or a whole family of ancestors, or possibly just one significant part of an ancestor's life. Now for me with military research, I really enjoy looking at that time of an ancestor's life. It's a time when they move away from their families and sometimes can develop greatly. It's also a time that ends up being very defining in their lives in some cases. My grandfather's timeline of his military service started just with his summary card with his abstract of military service in World War I. That's because his military records, personnel records that is, were burned in the fire at the National Personnel Records Center in 1973. Now you should always check if you're doing military research because the archivists have done amazing things with being able to restore some files. Sadly, my grandfather's and my father's were burned and can't even be located to attempt that kind of restoration. But I just had these 5 events, and then as I went through doing my research, going to all different facilities and archives, I filled in the lines between these initial points. Help me be organized, stay organized, and express what I had learned. Are you ready to write? Well, the first step would be to just open a word processing document. And I'm going to recommend this because they're useful if you're going to do online publishing. And most modern word processors will let you save a document in PDF. That's that Adobe Acrobat format that's easy for others to open. And something I hadn't mentioned is, well, you might want to make your book available as a web page. And usually word processing documents can save as HTML. If you want, you really can do this by hand. You can do it in sort of a scrapbook format where you actually write the pages and glue pictures on. Well, in that case, you probably want to scan or maybe just copy the pages so that you have them and then can distribute them to others. Well, this has been part 1. And in part 2, we're going to put pages together, show you how to do that step by step. Going to help you find some images, talk about the other parts of the book, and then your publishing choices. And I'll show you an example of how I did Marching in Mules, the story of a pioneer infantryman in World War I. I hope you'll have a chance to check out my books on Amazon.com, write their story from timeline to young reader's book, as well as Marching in Mules, the book that I wrote using this process. You can find out more about me at my website or at the Amazon authors page. So thank you for watching, and feel free to reach out to aweekofgenealogy@gmail.com.